Well, in this next session, we will delve into the smooth merging of physical and digital avenues in facilitating extensive availability of financial services to individuals without bank accounts or with limited banking access. We have with us Dr. Charu Bharat, Assistant Professor Economics, ASMSOC and NMIMS University. Please put your hands together for ma'am, and she would talk in detail about Phygital, yes, Phygital Infrastructure and enhancement of financial inclusion in India. Please put your hands together once again for our lovely lady. Ma'am, please.
Good afternoon to all present. So, as a little bit of an introduction was given about the topic, and I'm actually into academia for past 11 years, and economics being one of my most beloved areas. This was one area in fintech which is a very niche segment, very little spoken about, and yet it contains a lot of potential for the future. So we are right now entering into, or rather the next 1 hour, we'll be discussing into a very, very interesting topic, which is the fascinating concept of digital infrastructure and how it has enhanced the realm of financial inclusion in India. So before we delve into the details of Phygital, I just had a few images from Google Maps to show to you, which is, these are a few locations that I wanted to highlight. If you can see on this map here, there is a very small village in the Baramulla district, which is in Kashmir. And the tehsil is Tangmarg, which is, I mean, we are talking about a village here that has a population of less than 2,000. Right? If you were to really search on Google Maps, it is going to be difficult for you to find out that Gani Baba is one village out there with such a small population. We'll come to the significance, or rather, I'll join the dots later on that why I'm showing these images right now. This is another small village with a population of less than 4,000. We are talking about Netra village, which is in Tehsil Bawri, and the district is Jodhpur in Rajasthan. Again, a very, very small village, which is difficult to spot on Google Maps. So now, I mean, the reason why we are talking about these places is because we are talking about financial inclusion. And we have to understand, or rather we have to look into the aspects that what exactly is the state of financial inclusion in places like these, which are very difficult to spot, which is people at the bottom of the pyramid in terms of fintech, you could say, changes that are happening around. So we would be interested to know in knowing the state of financial inclusion of these places. So what is financial inclusion? I mean, financial inclusion simply, for the sake of convenience for all of you, refers to the process of ensuring that all individuals, especially the underserved and marginalized populations, have access to affordable and appropriate financial services. We'll be looking into a few statistics, which is what is the current state of our rural economy and financial inclusion at present. So if we see right now, in India, we have 65% of the population which is actually rural. And reason we are more so talking about rural economy is because it's difficult for all of the financial technologies and financial innovations to reach with a lot of difficulty in the rural areas. So that's a very big segment of population. And we're talking about 19 crores of population that is still unbanked, which majorly comprises of rural population in India. And overall, if we look at the literacy, like we have almost around more than 75% of people who are literate. But if we look at financial literacy, that's pretty low, which is we are talking about 27%. One very contrasting, rather a significant change that we have seen in India, especially post-COVID, is the number of rural population that have access to internet-enabled smartphones, which is, we are talking about more than 75% in rural areas that have access to a smartphone. And that is considerably higher than we look at a pre-COVID numbers, which is almost only around at 36%, which is in 2018. That's a way big stride because we see the number of smartphones and internet access has increased drastically. So I mean, if there is a good amount of internet access, then possibly the usage of fintech in rural areas should also be good. In contrast to the logical connection between both of them, it isn't really the case. If you see some of the bank statistics, which is we are talking about one bank for every 12 villages in India, the number of ATMs available. Now, this slide specifically is looking into the physical infrastructure specifically that's available in overall when you're talking about India and specifically rural India. ATMs per 100,000 adults, which is we are looking at 21.44. 14.58 bank branches are available per 100,000 people, which is, if you're looking at the World Bank average, that's 29.97. World average for ATMs is 51.89, which is much higher. So we can see that there is definitely a lack of physical infrastructure which the government and the banking system is providing, especially in the rural areas. Now, these statistics actually are pointing out to a very important disconnect that is there, which is even though the number of bank accounts has increased tenfold from 2010 up till now, but despite the number of bank accounts increasing, people still do not have access to basic financial services, or how do they make a transfer, how do they withdraw money, how do they do any kind of a deposit, which is where the entire, you could say, topic of phygital or rather thing comes into place. Now, before we actually get into phygital, there are a couple of more issues that are actually there, which is keeping the rural India from actually foraying into the uncharted or rather the murky waters of going completely digital. So despite the internet access being so high, and there was a study that was being done by Nielsen, which actually pointed out that the usage of internet was actually 20% higher in rural India than in urban India, which is over the last 1-2 years it's happened. Now, despite all of these things, which is internet is being used, but more so the internet usage in rural India is for watching videos, social media, and more so for entertainment purposes. But when it comes to talking about the usage of internet for doing transactions, which is the financial aspect, that is much lower. So some of the important, you could say, reasons for why the rural India is actually away from, you could say, using technology when it comes to doing financial transactions is one, lack of awareness. When you talk about rural India now, because most of the people have little know-how, there's also ignorance about the new, you could say, schemes, programs, you could say new technologies that are available. And traditionally also people in rural areas, they prefer using cash rather than any of these technologies that are available. Trust is one of the biggest factors, I believe, which is keeping people in rural areas from actually it creates a hindrance for them to be using any of these technologies, which is, if you talk to any of the, you could say, people who belong to the lower strata or the marginalized population, most of them prefer to do a certain activity only if the people around them are into that, or probably if they see a sort of a trust which is only possible with a personal connection. If the personal connection is not there, which is a physical touch point isn't there, people wouldn't really want to get into those uncharted waters. Increasing cyber frauds. Now, we know that over the past couple of years, and especially post-COVID, in fintech as a space, cyber frauds have increased drastically. And it's more so a concern both in rural and urban areas, but then because of the conservative nature of the population in rural areas, once the word spreads in a certain village, that is, a fraud has occurred, the rest of the people wouldn't really be willing into doing the transaction. Literacy levels are very low, which is why, because of the lack of know-how, and which is what our Honorable FM also mentioned today while answering one of the questions, that the digital divide is mainly existing because of financial literacy as such, which is so low. And which is where RBI is also taking a lot of measures into increasing the literacy levels. So reliance on cash is one important aspect of when you're looking into uh, why that digital divide continues to exist. Now, most of the people in rural areas would do their daily transactions, particularly agricultural sector, when farmers would have to pay, you could say, daily wages to the tenant farmers, or probably, you could say, buy any agricultural inputs, buy, you could say, vegetables, buy grains from a kirana store. Everything, every possible transaction, most of it is done using cash, and which is what is actually keeping the digital transformation to, be away from India. Um, so cash, the reason why people rely on cash primarily is because it provides them with instant liquidity. And that liquidity is the most important ingredient, because there is a non-availability of credit lines when we talk about rural areas. I mean, the reason why rural India has primarily been relying on cash is because of the money lenders, or because of the traditional system that banking isn't really providing a lot of funding, a lot of, you could say, small microcredit loans to farmers, which is why cash primarily is very important. So here also, I mean, when you talk about the first example, which is when we spoke about the village, Gani Baba, which is a very, very small village in Kashmir, um, the bank branch is very far. So people, even if they do had a bank account, they really had to rely on cash transactions, because on a daily basis, you wouldn't want to travel 10 kilometers away to actually avail or, withdraw funds from a bank. Non-tech savvy, which is in terms of, you could say, penetration of active internet users, urban India is still leading with a 59% share. But when you're talking about, I mean, in terms of usage for financial purposes, that is still very low. So there is a saying that you can't have best of both worlds, but sometimes you do have the best of both worlds, which is we are talking about phygital here, and phygital infrastructure, which is we are talking about a blend of the physical world with the digital world, or when you're talking about the physical and digital realms, when they are seamlessly intertwined, transforming your everyday experiences, interactions, your financial transactions. So, which is where we talk about phygital. So at the core, the phygital bridges the gap between tangible and the virtual worlds, and this harmonious blending of both of the physical and digital worlds, in fact, is very, very important for fintech as a sector. So even though we see a lot of phygital aspects now coming up in e-commerce, retail, and other sectors, but specifically for fintech, there are major transformations that are happening. So what exactly is phygital? We're referring to seamless integration of channels, like we are talking about physical touch points, such as the brick and mortar stores, the brick and mortar branches, and ATMs, and they being intertwined with digital channels like mobile apps, online platforms, which are going to make transactions much more easier for rural India. So in turn, it signifies you could say, a convergence of both of these spheres, which creates a very, very big holistic ecosystem, and that is enhancing three important elements, which is accessibility, convenience, and efficiency. So when you're looking at the phygital landscape, which is, we are talking about a couple of things here, which is, what are the advantages, which is when you're talking about overall the disadvantages that were actually being created by the physical landscape, they're actually being covered by digital here, which is it becomes cost efficient, it's more convenient. We are talking about a much bigger customer engagement. So basically, personalization is one very important factor, which is very important for rural India. And when we talk about rural India as such, the customer engagement is a very important concept for them to be relying on any simple factor. Other than that, we're also looking at financial literacy. And the last one is that it kind of builds a trust, the trust factor that wasn't there only when we look at the digital aspect. So looking at the phygital landscape, which is a lot of you might be thinking that what exactly or what kind of instruments would come under the phygital landscape when you look at the various kinds of products, various services that are being available. So on the demand side, we see debit cards, we see credit cards, we see PPIs, and there is FASTags. So I mean, we'll be looking further into these slides about what are the different trends available for all of these instruments here. Um, Prepaid, you could say instruments, the payment instruments is one of those areas where we have seen massive strides in terms of how you could say there is a drastic increase in the number of people who are actually using them. On the supply side, we have ATMs, we have point of sale terminals, we have the QR codes. Specifically, I'm talking about Bharat QR, which is again doing massive strides here. We have micro ATMs. Now, specifically, when we're looking at the phygital landscape, we'll be focusing a lot on micro ATMs and other enabled payment services. So, micro ATMs are such infrastructure facilities which are being created, or rather RBI has kind of introduced them, which is, it requires much lesser amount of investment, but also creates an infrastructure even in the remotest of villages. So, I mean, when you're talking about overall a setup of a micro ATM, firms that have actually had a setup, or rather banks, they've realized that their cost actually reduces by more than 40% with a micro ATM infrastructure setup being done. Aadhaar-enabled payment services, which is by a simple method of biometric being done. You having you could say an Aadhaar card. A simple payment or bank transfer could be done with both of these things being there with you. So you just need a bank account, an Aadhaar card, and your biometric verification. Bharat Bill Payment System is again interoperable, you could say, system that was being created by NPCI to actually do, or rather have a seamless integration of all the bill payments possible. So this is again another important area. Okay, looking at the numbers here, I'll probably need to shift it there a little bit. Or rather, I'll come in. Could I take the mic this side? Yeah, this would be it. Because I need to see the number. So if we look at the number of BSBD accounts, which is, we are talking about the no-frills accounts here, the basic saving bank deposit accounts. And when we actually talk about the access, or rather financial inclusion, or rather we want to know the scope of financial inclusion, of how it has increased in India, one very important indicator for that is when you look at the number of bank accounts that are opened where you do not require any balance to be maintained, which is these no-frills accounts. So the term that we use there is BSBDS. So if you see from 2010 up till 2023, there's actually a remarkable more than 9%, 9 times an increase in the number of basic saving bank deposit accounts from 7.35 crores to 67.86 crores. Now, that kind of indicates the depth of financial inclusion, the number of accounts that are there. This has to be coupled with other important factors that even though the bank account is there, but are people really using those bank accounts? So if you see the number of credit card and debit card, which are actually, I mean, quite heartening to see. From 2020 to 2023, we see from 576.32 lakhs, the number of debit cards has increased to 898. Almost a two-fold jump. And credit cards, if you see, 1.1-fold a jump is there, which is in terms of number of credit cards. Debit cards primarily have seen a bigger jump because of the RuPay cards, and in terms of when we see that majorly a debit card is needed if you have to withdraw money or do any kind of the transactions that were previously mentioned on the landscape part. Number of micro ATMs. Now, micro ATMs, work only with the help of, or rather, there is just a POS terminal that is needed to operate a micro ATM. Like you do not really need a very big setup. So if you see from 2020 up till 2023, we are talking about a 5 times increase almost in the number of micro ATMs, and which is where we'll also be focusing on the phygital model today. Number of POS terminals, which is, we are talking about the point of sale terminals, again, almost a twofold jump here in the number of POS terminals, which is again attributable to how you could say the phygital landscape is spreading across in rural India. You'd be surprised to know that even in, I'm just giving an example of Mumbai. If you were to go to some of these local street markets, and I was surprised to see at one of the markets here, which is around in Andheri, towards the station, these local vendors are seated on the sides. And one of these vendors actually had you could say, a big banner that they do accept credit cards for payments. Now, this is the kind of transition we are talking where, the local roadside vendors also do accept POS-based payments. Bharat QR, which is, again, we're talking about a revolutionary, you could say, a feat that we have achieved, which is in terms of the QR code-based payments. And again, we see that there is a very big increase here in terms of the number of, you could say, the QR codes that are being available and which are being massively used by the different stakeholders. Number of AEPS transactions, if we see in rural India, we are talking about an increase or rather a jump from 2018 to 2022, which is, if you see the monthly transactions in million, it's almost more than 130 times a jump that we're seeing here, which is remarkable in terms of how you could say these transactions that are being done. And as I mentioned earlier, AEPS simply requires a particular person to have a bank account, the biometric, which is a thumbprint, and they just need their Aadhaar card. That's it. So the reason why this jump has been seen in rural India, we'll come to that. Look at the value of AEPS transactions from 149.30 crores, we are talking about 27,191 crores. And this is the value of transactions, which is again pointing out to the ease with which people are using this in rural areas. There has to be something that is actually making people to be using AEPS or rather moving towards QR codes. So what is that something? There are 3 kinds of broad phygital banking models, which is informational, transactional, and supportive. I'll just give you an example for all of them. When you're talking about informational models, it is basically looking into any kind of models where the banks are actually providing any sort of information digitally, which is either they might be using tablets or digital screens for the purpose of inseminating any information. Transactional phygital models is basically when you're looking at banks providing transactions using physical touch points, which is when you're talking about ATMs or when we talk about micro ATMs or when you're talking about POS. So any of these or QR codes, so these are basically transactional, you could say, models that are there. And supportive phygital banking models is when you're looking at a phygital model which involves you could say transactional, and also you're taking help of third-party agents, which is they are helping banking system in accessing or rather providing financial services to the underbanked or rather penetrating deeper into rural areas. So the model that I'm actually focusing today when we are talking about the phygital landscape or rather the phygital infrastructure is the BC model. We are talking about the BC model from the point of view of the business correspondents that have actually gotten themselves associated with the banking industry. So we're talking about a concept called as doorstep banking. Doorstep banking, or rather very simply put, I just want to give an example here for how the business correspondent model works actually. So sometimes, when I'm traveling from work to home, I would be running out of cash. And that happens quite a many of times. We know how much important the chutta is. when we are actually traveling every day in Mumbai. So I take a rickshaw. I rather get down near my house and realize that there is no money in my pocket, but I do have my phone and I have access to GPay. I have access to some of these digital payment modes that are there. I know a fruit vendor because I'm buying fruits and vegetables from him daily. So I just go and tell him if he could give me some cash and I could make a direct transfer to him via GPay because he's using the QR code system. So I do a transfer and I take some money, or rather he's helping me withdraw some money from him because I have to make a payment to the rickshaw guy. And this is what the BC model actually is in a very, very simple, you could say, language. So business correspondent model actually looks into how these third-party agents who are actually not a part of the formal banking sector, but then they are appointed agents of the banks. They are third-party agents of private fintech players. They are retired teachers, retired government officials. These are people who are ex-servicemen. And because they're staying in a rural area, they have certain amount of funds with them, which they can actually utilize for all of these basic banking activities. They provide these services in the villages, which is why the last mile delivery. So if you see the number of BCs in 2022, it's 13 lakh business correspondents. Another term for the business correspondents is e-mitra. So e-mitra is how you would usually address them when you talk about in rural India. So these e-mitra services are the third-party agents who actually provide all of these banking services through a physical touch point. You would be amazed to see the kind of physical touch point that we'll be talking about, which is some of them are, like one of them is when you talk about the Kirana stores. Now, if we talk about the banking outlets in villages via the BC mode, which is we are talking about the business correspondence, it's 97%. The branches in rural areas is barely 3% when you're looking into the banking numbers. Okay. Yeah. So I was talking about Kirana Tech here, which is we looking into the BC model, which is, I mean, overall, when you're talking about the business correspondent model, these third-party agents usually have their retail setup, which is either they would have their own mobile accessory shop, they'll have a very small printing stationery shop, or usually they would operate out of a retail store. Now, people usually who are living in a small village like these, which is two of them that I had mentioned, they would usually know about, the Kirana stores, and they know these Kirana people personally. So which is where Phygital really bridges that gap and creates a trust factor. You know the Kirana guy who is there in your village. So it's easy to trust him because you're dealing with him day in and day out, and he's not going to run away with your money. So which is why transactions that are usually happening now in villages, which is what we saw in the slides earlier, that the number of APS transactions, of how they saw a drastic increase, or the number of Bharat QR codes that are there, or overall when we looked at the number of POS terminals, the amount of transactions that have happened, that is just pointing to one very important factor, that there is a trust factor that is building because of these e-mitras that are there. So as I mentioned earlier, there are a couple of categories of business correspondents. We have individual BCs, there are banking agents, micro ATM operators, kiosk operators, there are customer service points, and because of that, there has been a drastic increase overall, which is why now this new realm is emerging, which is the Kirana Tech. Government and RBI per se, they have been focusing a lot into actively promoting and using the BC model, owing to the kind of, you could say, operational cost efficiency that's involved here. Like, I mean, when you look at this entire model, there is very little, you could say, investment, very little cost that is involved here. You're involving these people who have some particular corpus of funds into actually utilizing this, and also providing, you could say, much greater level of financial inclusion and services to people. So some of the services that are being provided by BCs, which is the e-mitras, is cash withdrawal, cash deposit, there is balance inquiry, there's fund transfer, e-KYC, bill payments. So you can actually do all of the basic banking services using these e-mitras that are there in any of these rural areas. The contrast in terms of the banking outlets in villages, which I just mentioned a few minutes back about when you talk about branches versus when you talk about the business correspondent model, the drastic difference that is there in terms of the branch presence in a village versus the BC presence that is there. And I think this one particular model is a game changer. If we see overall in the next couple of years and with 5G, it's going to bring about massive strides, because right now, when the only concern that is there in rural areas is about a very weak internet connectivity, which is why even though internet is available, but then the connection is not really smooth. It's not there all the time, and which is why transaction sometimes is difficult. There are a lot of you could say, servers are getting down and problems like that. So BCICT is basically all of the transactions which are enabled, or rather these are the digital transactions which are being done by business correspondents or these e-mitra. So e-mitra actually are doing transactions which if you look at from 2010 to 2022, we're talking about 270 lakh transactions to now it's in 2022, we have 25,434 lakh transactions happening. I mean, with respect to the village that I mentioned, which is Netra village in Rajasthan, this one e-mitra who is actually working, and he's the only e-mitra in Netra, in a month, he's doing almost transactions of 8 to 10 lakhs. With a population of just less than around 3.5 to 4,000, imagine the number of transactions that he's doing. So I just kind of mentioned to him that, you know, you must be doing like transactions of what, like 50,000, 1 lakh? And he said, no, it's almost like around 7 to 8 lakhs that I'm doing every month. And he's making good deal of money. So this is what is driving them to be actually being a e-mitra. Yeah, so these are the total banking outlets in villages, which is, we are talking about from the BC perspective. You can see the numbers here and the kind of increase that we have seen from 2010, where we had 34,174 banking outlets which were being run by BCs, to now we have more than 16 lakh. So we have seen the overall picture in terms of the gaps, the kind of advantages which Phygital actually kind of bridges, and which is why we now see that as a result also, that when you see the, you know, the overall fintech, you could say, the progress in terms of the RBI's FI index, we see that there has been an increase from 43.4 to now it's actually come to 56.4. So this is the overall depth of financial inclusion that we have seen over the last couple of years. So I mean, if you were to really talk to somebody in a village and you were to make a mention कि आपके यहाँ पे अभी भी cash में payment होता है या आप cash में लेन-देन करते हैं, the instant answer would be a no. You would see that most of them would have a smartphone, they would have internet access to them, they are very, very well versed with AEPS, or they can do a transaction using micro ATM, withdrawals and payments are easy, fund transfer is easy. So role of government is critical when we are looking at the phygital infrastructure, and in fact, it's important to actually see that what are some of the initiatives that will actually deepen rather the scope of phygital infrastructure. So you must be knowing about Digital India as an initiative which has been taken by government, or when we talk about the JAM, you know, the set of factors which is, we are talking about Jandan, Aadhaar and mobile linkage, of how it has led to great transitions. Two important initiatives, which is we are talking about UPI Lite and UPI 123 Pay, again is going to increase financial inclusion when we talk about the rural India. So UPI Lite is looking into, you could say, transactions which could be done offline up till rupees 500. So you just need to, it's a wallet where you'll have to transfer some funds whenever you have internet access up till 2000. And then if you had to make a payment up till 500 rupees, even in an offline mode, it's easy to do using UPI Lite. UPI 123 Pay is specifically for an initiative for rural India where majority of the people, or rather a big segment of population, has feature phones, which is when you talk about the phones with buttons. So it makes possible the entire usage of doing a transaction using the IVR technology. Digisati is just a platform which has been created by RBI to actually do a resolution in terms of any of the grievances that are there for digital payments. So I kind of believe in a saying that life comes a full circle. So in the beginning of my slides, I had shown you the images of two villages, very remote villages in India. And these are actual images from those villages, where I'm trying to show you that these are some of these physical touch points which are making you could say, access to financial services very, very easy. So right there in the Gani Baba village, it's called as the Khidmat Center. So Khidmat centers are basically centers which are actually providing these services of all the basic banking transactions being done. And it's actually a printing shop. So this guy there provides all the basic services of if you had to do an eKYC, update Aadhaar, or you had to, yeah, if you had to do any kind of a fund transfer, you had to withdraw funds, you had to deposit something, you could just go to this printing shop, next neighbor, doorstep banking, and get it done. Some of the pictures from Gani Baba, which is the people are actually doing transactions here. This is AEPS being done there. So you can see the infrastructure involved here. And also because of physical touch point there, people are finding it much easier to actually rely and do the transaction. These are pictures from Netra, which is this guy there. He is an e-mitra himself. And this is his shop, which is he's operating out of a printing shop, which is doing transactions there. And all of the transactions that I just mentioned are being done easily. So what he's holding there is a micro ATM, and which is what makes it much easier for people there to transact. Again, picture from Netra, which is we are talking about the Kirana shop. And this Kirana shop is actually transformed into a banking, you could say, a touch point. So you actually go and buy your grocery and stuff, and also if you had any banking transactions, you could do them. So micro ATM. So these are the pictures from Netra itself, which is they're talking about how they're actually using micro ATM as a instrument there in actually getting more people into the fintech space. So overall, throughout this presentation, my view was to just explain that there are a couple of problems which are there, which is what is keeping the rural India from, or rather Bharat from going completely digital, and how now we are seeing massive strides. So the only problem that we see right now is when we talk about the number of cyber frauds that are happening, and which is where if we kind of strengthen, or rather the government and the central bank takes a lot of regulatory steps actually to strengthening this entire framework, I think in a couple of years we would see that instead of phygital, there will be bigger strides when we are actually going completely digital in the entire rural landscape as well. So these are, in case if you would want to connect, I've just given my details, my email ID. Any questions here? Yep. So, right. Yeah. Right. Right. So I'll give you an example here, which is the e-mitra, like the agent that was here. He's working as an adhikari with Spice Money. Spice Money is one fintech company which is actually working, or rather has appointed a lot of these third-party agents. And what they usually have to do is, which is these e-mitras usually have to have their own funds, which is his own self-invested own savings. And he has to make sure that whatever his savings are there, he would invest them. And through the portal that has been created by Spice Money, all of these transactions happen, which is any kind of a fund that has been initiated, which is any kind of an inflow, any kind of transaction, which is the fund has to be deposited. All of the funds which are there with the Spice Money Adhikari or the e-mitra are being used there in actually doing that fund transfer. So he receives cash from the, the local person, the villager who is there, and the accounts are actually being, you could say, transferred from his own account. And as soon as the transaction is being done, Spice Money immediately kind of replenishes it into their account, and which is why the entire process works seamlessly. So if somebody actually wants to become an adhikari or an agent, or you could say like a BC here, there aren't too many strict, stringent requirements there. One of the requirements is that they should be a local person living in that village. Secondly, they should be having a sufficient amount of funds with them, which is what I asked the guy here, that he had a good amount of savings with him, which he could actually utilize for the business. And for every transaction they do, they earn a commission, which is on the basis of transaction, which is where the commission amount is transferred instantly. And they are making somewhere around 25 to 30,000 per month on the basis of the number of transactions there. It can even go up till 50,000. Yeah. Yeah. I can't hear you. Yeah.
I was saying it's not a question. Basically, I want to bring to your notice that whatever you covered in the slides basically reflects what we are doing. It's almost like we are reaching out to villagers. We are running financial literacy programs, and through micro ATM where the postman is able to deliver the cash and provide banking services. Probably next time we could find one or two slides about India Post Payments Bank and how the postman is impacting the basic rural India. I would be of great
About the
interest.
financial literacy aspect?
Yeah, financial literacy, even the banking services.
Yes.
Like I'll tell you the background of this. We are from under Department of Post, BCs or our the postman. BC or postmen are onboarded as our BCs. They provide the banking services to the rural population. Basically,
Yes.
all the population is of rural base, where the Aadhaar CDs, DBT accounts, or the payments
Yes.
are made through AEPS, and also the other services.
Yes.
It's like, but it's all covers about these services. But I have seen that nowhere it's our organization is mentioned here.
So I had a limited time, and I mean, it's a lot to cover in 1 hour. Of course, I appreciate, and I know that there are other things that could have been covered in your. We'll make sure that I kind of incorporate them. I mean, when you talk about any aspect of fintech as such, you would realize and you would know that there is so much to talk about even beyond these slides. Like there were so many things that I actually did not even touch upon, which are there, in my sheets of paper, which I thought that I'll probably share. But yes, time was a constraint. Yes. Thank you so
I
much for the
understand,
feedback.
ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
So you spoke about digital infrastructure.
Yeah.
Are you also working on like how we can move the customers from an assisted model to a self-service model? So physical versus digital is one debate, and the self-service and assisted is another. So how are you going to connect? And in the physical model, are we taking any effort to train or educate these people to avail these services by themselves? I'm talking about additional, not cash in, cash out, other than cash out.
So, I mean, recently there have been initiatives which is in terms of financial literacy. A lot of programs have been started by RBI to actually enhance financial literacy. Because financial literacy, whether we talk about rural or urban areas, is very, very low. I mean, in terms of their overall, you could say there was one more study which actually showed that out of a score of 21, both in rural and urban areas for financial literacy, the overall score that we have now in 2022 was only 11.7. So, I mean, there are there is a lot of potential to actually, making people to actually go into a self-service mode, and which is where I think if financial literacy is worked on, which the government is working thoroughly in increasing the pace of literacy, I think eventually we'll see that you would be moving towards self-service. But again, I feel that for rural India, um, the phygital model is still going to be very important. And the reason is that people are so conservative out there. Like, a word of any fraud happening, it spreads instantly. Like, you would know if you have any people or if you know somebody from, a gaon or a village. It's very, very difficult to actually keep something closed doors there. And kirana guy or a printing guy next to you is like the most reliable person you'll ever meet. So you might not rely completely on doing an APS or a UPI transaction yourself, because you know that probably a fraud could happen if you shared the PIN with someone, or rather the PIN getting lost or something. A fraud could instantly happen. But the kirana guy, if you go to him, for sure nothing is going wrong. Your money is not going into wrong hands. And I mean, like with my discussion with both of them, both of these e-mitras, I asked them specifically, like, do you find any problems with this model as such, or you're finding any kind of criticism or any kind of loopholes? The only thing both of them mentioned was that internet connectivity is a problem sometimes. Otherwise, it is so well accepted across both of these villages, and which is where I think it's still going to stay. Yeah.
Right. I think we can have one last question.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
It's a different kind of question. One of the most successful banking stories I've come across was the Manipal story, which started with 25 paise deposits. Okay. Now, that led to the creation of Syndicate Bank. I believe that there's a possibility of using the same technology, because if you have a money market mutual fund, you don't need a passport. You have a ledger.
Yeah.
So technically, your e-mitras could also start a money market mutual fund of 1 rupee deposits.
Yes.
Why hasn't anyone entered that space?
Again, a thing for the future, maybe, because, when you're talking about the BC model, so even though it started back in 2006, but the popularity has started to increase, or rather it's become much more widely used only after 2020, which is post-COVID. So I think what you're saying is right, that it's going to happen, yes. Yeah. It's just about time.
No, I want 1 rupee a day. 25 paise was a deposit model for Syndicate Bank. Why can't it be 1 rupee a day deposit? Because a small man can't plan for 25 rupees. He can plan for 1 rupee.
Yeah.
And that would be a very good tool for education.
Absolutely.
Because the sector will be due.
And once you have cash flows, you have a credit profile.
Yeah.
Once you have credit profiles, you can go into education, you can go to consumer products, you can do many other things.
Yeah.
Which is surprised that the banking industry has woken up.
I think it should happen soon, owing to the fact that we are now progressing in terms of the post-COVID things settling down. It should happen. Yeah. Okay.
All right, we would call that a wrap, but quite an insightful yet interactive session this has been, and we would like to express our gratitude to Dr. Charu. So I request our technology partner, Perfios, to come on stage and, have a moment for ma'am up there. I'll take the mic and I'll empty your hands to have that moment of gratification. Please step forward, and can we please have a huge round of applause for this wonderful, insightful session.